When Floodgates Burst. The author orphaned their AO3 account, so I don't want to share that unless they give me permission. So I'm just going to link the series in the description instead of the author. I did get permission, though. Summary. Omegas are well known for their caring and patient nature. They were sensitive souls. But that's not to say they were weak. No, Omegas are terrifying, especially when their pups are in danger. Shinozagawa's blade dug through the box, stabbing into the demon, and the high-pitched wail that rang through the garden was unbearable. A pup was crying. 2 pups were crying. Tanjirou and whatever was in that box. When a pup cried like this, usually their parents came running, no matter how far away they were. It was a cry for help, only used when in severe distress or danger. And for a second, nothing happened. Then all hell broke loose. Shinozagawa was sent flying. Everyone else had fallen over in the process of whoever it was that had rushed over. The box that contained the demon was placed in front of that Kamado kid. The boy wrapped himself around it, protecting it with his own body as he sobbed. As their days cleared, they realized that it had been Tomioka to rush to the kid's aid, reeking of distressed, enraged Omega. But that didn't make sense. Tomioka was a beta, right? To say they were confused was an understatement. Chapter 1. First Meetings. Being a demonslayer wasn't pretty. It wasn't an easy job, and it never got any easier. You had to kill children, or at least monsters who were once children. You had to live with the guilt of not being fast enough, not being able to save everyone, and not being able to do anything. It was hopeless, yet it was needed. If demon slayers weren't there, humanity itself would diminish. Keeping that in mind, Tomioka Giyuu hurried his steps. He'd already checked the house, dead, all of them, children, young children, and their mother. But footprints carried off in the direction down the mountain, down towards the town. Had one survived? He almost wished they hadn't, so whoever it was wouldn't have to live with the grief. He followed the tracks, urging himself to be faster. The demon could still be around. It wasn't exactly morning yet. Yet, when he caught up, he almost threw up. 2 kids, 2 pups. One human and the other a demon. Both were crying. The human boy was shouting, sobbing, pleading. The demon girl seemed to be doing her best to control herself. But it wouldn't last. She was newly turned, and she was starving. Feeling sick, Tomioka pulled out his sword. Keeping his presence hidden until the last second, he lashed out and missed. The boy tossed himself over her, protecting her. This was going to be so much more difficult than he'd first thought. Giyuu's frown deepened. In a single swift motion, he grabbed the demon, keeping it away from the boy. Why did you protect it? It was obvious they must have known each other, but how? She's my sister. Oh, she's my little sister, the Omegan boy cried out. Please don't kill her. The scent of distress, sorrow, horror, and fear that reeked from this boy was overwhelmingly sickening. Something dormant inside of Giyuu twitched. Yet he ignored it in favor of using his own logic. She wasn't always like this. I don't know what happened, but I'll fix it. Please stop. Isn't it obvious? Giyuu spoke through gritted teeth. Your sister's become a man-eating demon. She will kill and devour innocent people. He raised his blade. Though rather than slashing her neck, he stabbed it into her shoulder. He was doing the right thing, but still, he felt guilty about it for some reason. Please, please stop. Don't kill her. I'm begging you. Please don't hurt her. He blubbered, crying his eyes out. She won't kill anyone. She won't devour anyone. She'd never hurt others, so please let her go. Tightening his grip on his blade, he bit his lip so hard it almost bled. And for the first time in many years, he found himself raising his voice, yelling, screaming, scolding. Never give others a chance to kill you. How do you expect to get anything done with begging? And what was that before? Throwing yourself over her. Was that your way of protecting her? Don't make me laugh. You'll only get both of you killed. If you want to stop me, pick up your hatchet and stop me yourself. Realizing that begging wouldn't work, the boy got up, wiping his tears. As Giyuu raised the blade to strike again, this time much closer to her neck, he shrieked, "Knock it off!" The wind swept the snow across the field, blocking their vision. Giyuu could clearly scent and detect him, the scent of distress. Juvenile Omega was a hard scent to hide. The boy rushed at him, hiding his hatchet behind him. Again, Giyuu scoffed, a head-on attack, driven only by emotions. Idiot. Still, he didn't want to hurt the boy. He was only a child. Only a child. Only a child. Only a child. A child who'd seen his entire family massacred because he was too slow. The pup dropped to the ground, unconscious. His hatchet wasn't there. Where was it? The tree behind him vibrated with the force of the hatchet digging into it. It landed right next to Giyuu, barely missing his face. The demon in his arms twisted and struggled with more force. She kicked him into the tree, rushing towards her brother. "Shit!" Giyuu shouted, reaching for his blade as he struggled to catch his balance. Yet, before he could attack, instead of devouring the boy, she stopped in front of him. She was protecting him. His entire world view flipped upside down. That didn't make sense. She was newly turned. She was starving. She was wasting energy trying to fight him off. Yet she didn't make any moves to devour the free meal at her feet. She'd never devour humans. Was that even possible? Was it even allowed? Was this treason? Grunting, he slammed the hilt of the blade against the back of her neck, knocking her unconscious. Slipping a bamboo muzzle into her mouth, he stepped back and waited for them to wake up. It took a good 20 minutes, but the boy woke up first. He grabbed his sister, holding her close to him, glaring at Tomioka. "You said you wanted to find a cure for her, right?" The boy slowly nodded. "That's not possible. But the higher-level demons might know a way. But don't think they'll just give you the answer. You'll have to fight. You'll have to train until you die." "How do I do that?" the boy croaked, dropping his scowl. "Head towards Mount Sagiri. Search for a man named Orokodaki Sakonji. He'll be able to train you to become a demonslayer." Was this a mistake? Would this kid be able to make it past final selection? This was a bad idea. Still, he couldn't just kill the demon girl. She hadn't done anything wrong, yet, and that boy would truly be alone. Another thing to remember. Giyuu tried to hide the waver in his voice. Never let your sister be exposed to sunlight. Demons die in the sunlight. She seems to be fine right now since it's cloudy, but be careful. He turned to leave, but the boy called out to him. "Wait, where are you going?" "I'm going to save other people. Take care." If he stayed any longer, he'd overthink it. If he stayed any longer, the people who needed saving would die. Even still, something about leaving these two pups alone like this seemed so wrong. "What's your name?" the boy asked, wiping his eyes of freshly shed tears. "Tomioka Giyuu." He found himself answering. Strange. He usually didn't give his name out to people, even those he rescued. "Tomioka Giyuu," the pup echoed, sniffing tiredly. "I'm Kamado Tanjirou. This is my sister, Nezuko. Thank you for sparing her, Tomioka." His eyes, such kind eyes, such caring eyes, such young eyes. He really was only a child. Only a pup. Giyuu nodded awkwardly, jumping away as the wind mixed snow into the sky again. This was probably a huge mistake, said the logical side of him. Yet, the dormant emotional side of him stirred in its sleeping state, protesting against a cold-hearted logic. While it was maybe borderline treason against the core, Giyuu found himself intrigued on how this would play out. Chapter 2. Pre-Final Selection. For a while, he heard nothing of the Kamado siblings. He thought nothing of them, going on with his life, until a good 6 months later when he received a letter from Kamado Tanjirou. Within the note was a genuine thank you, along with an invitation to Mount Sagiri to visit. At first he was about to decline. He wanted to refuse, yet again something buried deep inside him urged him to at least go check in. It wasn't that Giyuu didn't want to see the siblings. It was Orokodaki that he didn't wish to see. Giyuu sighed just thinking about it. Ever since Sabito's death, well, they hadn't kept in touch, unless for business. Well, to be exact, Giyuu didn't keep in touch unless it was for business. His master invited him for dinner or tea often, yet he always refused. He couldn't bear to face his master, not after how horribly he'd failed him. He failed him by being so weak, by not being able to protect Sabito. Giyuu would never be able to forget the heartbroken expression on Orokodaki's face when he had returned from final selection alone. Giyuu knew very well that Orokodaki didn't blame him at all. Still, he couldn't shake off his own guilt, and he knew that the minute his master opened the door, the minute his master opened his arms for a hug, Giyuu wouldn't be able to hold back. He'd cry, he'd break down, he'd keep coming back, he'd be vulnerable. Getting close to Orokodaki only risked disappointing him more. Giyuu wasn't sure he'd be able to go through that pain twice. And yet, he missed his master so much that it hurt. He wanted to make sure those pups were okay. What was the harm, really? It would only be one visit, right? High on a rush of carelessness, he answered the letter, promising to stop by within the next 2 months. At least he'd have time to prepare himself. 2 months passed. He did his best, but truly he wasn't prepared at all. He brought his hand up to knock on the cozy little shack's door. His hand froze in midair, trembling. For some reason, he wanted to cry. The place was exactly the same as he'd left it. He could still remember clearly running away as Sabito chased him with a wooden sword, Orokodaki scolding them lightheartedly. His heart clenched. He brought his hand down on the door before he could drown in his own mind. The door swung open. Commodore Tanjirou gasped, delighted. He tossed himself at Giyuu, hugging him. "I'm so glad you came." He paused, realizing what he'd done. Slowly, he pulled back, smiling sheepishly. Sorry, I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." "It's fine." And for once, he was honest. He didn't mind the affection. How strange, considering how he usually avoided it at all costs. "How's your training going?" he asked. If Tanjirou seemed sheepish before, he appeared downright embarrassed now. I'm making progress," he settled on saying. The kid looked a bit roughed up, cuts on his face, hair slightly tangled, and his breath was a bit uneven. If Giyuu had to guess, he'd say the boy had just finished making his way down the mountain. "The first year is always the hardest," Giyuu found himself saying, blinking softly. "It'll get easier. If you haven't quit so far, I know you'll make it to the end." Tanjiro brightened at that. "Thank you." Giyuu nodded, trying to think of a conversation topic. He went to the next thing he'd been questioning. "How's your sister?" Tanjiro sighed, smile fading. Immediately, Giyuu thought the worst. Had Nezuko died? Had Nezuko attacked someone? Had Nezuko been hurt? "She's asleep." Oh, that didn't seem that bad. Why did he seem so sad when he said it, though? "She's been asleep for the past 5 months," Tanjiro finished. "She hasn't woken up at all, not even once." "Oh." "I'm honestly really worried that she won't ever wake up again." And there it is, the heavy scent of distress that made Giyuu want to cry. Awkwardly, stiffly, he reached out to ruffle Tanjiro's hair. "Your sister will wake up." He didn't elaborate. He didn't have any answers on why she was sleeping so much, but there must be a reason, considering how abnormal she was. Tanjiro easily leaned into the touch, smiling. "Where's Orokodaki?" Giyuu asked next, preparing himself for the scolding he'd get. "Orokodaki's still at the top of the mountain. I think he's setting up more traps." The kid rubbed at his eye sleepily. "Would you like to go see him?" No. He'd rather put it off as long as possible, to be honest. He didn't feel like crying right now, and he'd rather not do it in front of this Komodo kid. Not right now. I'm sure he wouldn't appreciate being interrupted from his work. Tanjirou nodded, rambling about everything he'd learned. He'd learned about the first 2 water-breathing forms. He hadn't exactly mastered them yet, but he was working on it. To be fair, while water-breathing was one of the easiest styles to learn, it was the hardest to master completely. It had taken Giyuu years upon years even after becoming a Hashira. He'd trained until his hands bled, and until his body gave out. He sat and spoke with Kamado for a long while. The sun had almost risen completely, chasing the demons away. He was almost tempted to leave before seeing Orokodaki, and yet the door swung open before he could say as such. "Giyuu," Orokodaki greeted, expression hidden behind his Tengu mask. "You came." Giyuu did his best not to tremble as he stood up to bow and greet his master, the former water pillar. As he stood up, a pair of arms wrapped around him, hugging him. Orokodaki hadn't changed at all. He was as tough as he was caring, and he still smelled of pine and sandalwood. Giyuu did his best to blink back the overwhelming tears. He brought his arms up to hug him back, unable to hide his shaking. "You need to visit more often," Orokodaki grumbled half-heartedly. "It gets lonely around here." Giyuu nodded, and he wasn't sure if he would. Already he felt so exposed. He wasn't sure if he could keep this up. Still, he couldn't deny the appeal of this. It was warm, and he'd been freezing for so long. Tanjirou had excused himself to check on Nezuko, leaving them alone for their reunion. "I'm glad you're doing well." Orokodaki stepped back to properly inspect him. Satisfied that Giyuu wasn't bleeding out or anything, he stepped away. "Come, I'll make us some tea." And honestly, who was he to refuse? 30 minutes later, Tanjirou came to join them, smiling. Nezuko still hadn't woken up, but she was still breathing, and that's all that mattered to them. The day slowly started turning into night, which meant demons were going to start running around. Which meant he'd have to leave. Giyuu sighed, getting up. "You're leaving?" Tanjirou frowned. "Unfortunately, I can't stay here forever," Giyuu explained. Tanjirou contemplated on what to say next. Finally, he settled on saying, "Will you be coming back?" Orokodaki's eyes drilled into him, waiting expectantly for an answer. Giyuu wasn't sure. Yes, he wanted to say yes. He just wasn't sure if he'd be able to keep that promise. The life of a Hashira was terribly busy after all. "I'll try to stop by as often as possible between missions," he promised, resting his hand on Kamado's shoulder. Tanjirou leaned into the touch, smiling. "Okay, I'll look forward to it." Orokodaki nodded, pleased. Giyuu bowed again, taking his leave. After that, it became routine to visit them between every single one of his jobs. Today, he spent the day in the cabin while Orokodaki showed Tanjirou the boulder he'd have to slice to be approved for final selection. It was nauseating to be in front of the boulder, so Giyuu had chosen to stay behind, much to Tanjirou's confusion. He stood above Nezuko, combing his hand gently through her hair, untangling the fluffy strands. She seemed healthy, even though it's been over a year since she's last been awake. "Please, wake up soon, Nezuko." He surprised himself with how gentle he sounded. "Your brother misses you, and he's terribly worried." Maybe it was his imagination, but he could have sworn he felt her hand twitch against his own. 3 months passed, and Tanjirou still wasn't able to cut his boulder. In a way, Giyuu was glad. Final selection was hell within itself. With that hand demon still roaming around, it wasn't safe. It was never safe, but especially with him. He didn't want to think about it. He didn't want to think of being thrown back against the tree, immobilized. He didn't want to think about the terror he felt when Sabita's sword broke. He didn't want to think about the fear on his alpha's face. He didn't want to think about the way everything fell silent as his best friend's head was crushed. Blood sprang everyone, and it was his fault. It was all his fault. His fault, his fault, his fault. He was such a coward. He was so weak. It was all his fault that Sabito died. Would Tanjirou be able to make it? He had to. Giyuu wouldn't bear it otherwise. Another 9 months passed. Still no progress. Giyuu was worried now. He was still scared for Tanjirou's safety, yet he also feared for Nezuko. Every day that passed was a higher risk that she would just never wake up again, and then what? As much as he was scared for Tanjirou, he didn't want to leave Nezuko like this. So, with his heart in his hands, Giyuu exited the shack and moved towards the boulder's direction. When Giyuu arrived, he arrived at the very same second Tanjirou cut the boulder in half. For a split second, instead of seeing Tanjirou there, he saw Sabato, the same exhilarated grin. He turned to Giyuu. Giyuu, did you see that? I did it! Tanjirou dropped his sword, eyes filled with tears. They weren't tears of tragedy, merely tears of exhaustion. An entire year later, he'd done it. Giyuu nodded approvingly, opening his arms. Tanjirou ran into him, hugging him tight as he sobbed and wailed. A third pair of arms wrapped around the two of them, hugging them both tight. Tanjirou sniffled, welcoming and thanking Orokodaki profusely. Afterwards, they celebrated by having a feast. Tanjirou. Giyuu bit his lip. He wasn't supposed to warn Tanjirou of anything that happened within final selection. Please be careful. His heart ached. He didn't want Tanjirou's head to be crushed. He didn't want Tanjirou to die. In these past 2 years, he'd become more attached than he thought he would. This place was home, and these 3 were his family. A few weeks later, the day came. They hugged one last time, and before he pulled away, Giyuu squeezed the boy tightly and scented him. Tanjirou gasped, delighted. He basked in the sea salt scent, covering Giyuu in his own honeycomb smell. Please stay safe, Kamado Tanjirou. Giyuu whispered fearfully as Tanjirou faded from view, leaning heavily against Orokodaki's side. Chapter 3. Post-Final Selection. Giyuu had been counting the days until final selection's end. He'd been staying with Orokodaki the past 3 days, too stressed and shaky to go on missions. He'd been put on leave by Oyakata until final selection ended. I'm sorry to burden you. Giyuu apologized for the 15th time as his teacher poured him another cup of tea. His eyes drooped as he hid his shaky hands under the table. Orokodaki didn't answer at first, a barely contained sigh echoing through the tiny shack. Giyuu couldn't place what kind of sigh it was. Was his trainer disappointed? Was he annoyed? Was he tired? Was he worried? I apologize, he repeated. I don't know what's going on, but I promise I'll make it up to you. I won't repeat this mistake. Orokodaki stood straight at that, expression hidden behind his mask, leaving Giyuu trying to guess how he was feeling. Giyuu. His master shook his head. Quit apologizing. I don't mind giving you a calm place to rest. God knows you need it with all the running around you do. It's the job. How are you going to protect others if you drop dead from exhaustion? Orokodaki cut in. That boy needs you, so take care of yourself. Who? Tanjirou? Tanjirou needs Giyuu? No, that wasn't right. If anything, it was the other way around. Maybe it was selfish, maybe it was dangerous, but spending time with that pup made him feel like he was worth something. Like he had something to protect, something to cherish. As strange as it was, as new as it was to him, he couldn't let it go. I understand. He spoke slowly, bowing his head. I apologize. Orokodaki patted his head 3 times, then walked off to chop more wood. Alone, Giyuu pondered, listening to the sound of Nezuko's soft inhale and exhales to ground him. On the 4th day, Giyuu became restless. He swung his sword until his hands couldn't hold it up anymore. After a short rest, he took a turn going down the trap-filled mountain. At the very bottom, he stopped before that boulder, the very same boulder that Sabito had been so proud of. The same boulder that they sat on and whispered secrets and encouragements to each other. Heart aching and mood ruined, he turned and forced his feet to move away, settling inside the cabin. He wasn't even aware of what he was doing until he formed a makeshift nest. It was only once he laid inside the pile of blankets and pillows did he realize what he'd done. Heart wilting a bit, embarrassed, he was almost tempted to undo it. He just couldn't bring himself to, not with how comforting it was. Still, it was so embarrassing. You see, Omegas were welcome into the Demon Slayer Corps with open arms. Despite the prejudice in modern society, Omegas were equally as tough as any Beta or Alpha. Giyuu wasn't always ashamed of being an Omega. It was only after Sabito died did he realize how hindering it was. Emotions were a weakness. Attachments were a weakness. Omegas were sensitive souls that were so emotional that it sometimes hurt. Giyuu found himself far better pushing his feelings under the tide and letting them drown. After Sabito's death, after his turn at final selection, he'd pleaded for heat suppressants and scent blockers. "Are you sure? It's not recommended, especially for one as young as yourself." Orokodaki had questioned worriedly. He'd nodded determinedly, knowing the risk fully well after weeks of studying the aftermath of this medication. "Giyuu, you will most likely never be able to breed. You'll be prone to miscarriages and your heats will never have a normal schedule. They'll be more painful than usual. Your trademarked scent might also be dulled. Are you certain about this?" KNY double-checked, eyes filled with worry. "Please." And that was the end of that. But of course, fate had other plans for him. Introduced the Kamado siblings, waking his instincts again despite his desperate attempts to shove them out. A shuffle of blankets could be heard from the room next over. "Nezuko?" Giyuu questioned, sitting up. He sort of hoped Nezuko wouldn't wake up until Tanjirou got back. Tanjirou deserved to be the first to see her. But then again, fate didn't work that way. She was a tiny thing, tinier than Giyuu remembered. She shuffled out of the closet, eyeing Giyuu's nest curiously. "It's not my best work," he choked out, self-conscious now that someone else was here. "Are you okay?" She blinked twice, her pink eyes shining in the moonlight coming in from the windows. She nodded, rubbing sleepily at her eyes like a child waking up from a nap. Like a child. She is a child. She's only a child. He watched her as she sniffed the air, looking around. Her eyes landed back on Giyuu, her eyes wide. A dull scent of distress erupted from her glands, a question in her eyes. Immediately, Tomioka understood. "Where's my big brother?" her eyes seemed to ask. "Your brother's at final selection." She tilted her head, confused. "He's taking a test to become a demon slayer. Don't worry, he'll be back in 3 days. I promise." Don't make me break that promise, Kamado Tanjirou," he pleaded internally. Her distress calmed and diminished. She stretched her legs and walked a bit closer, blinking sleepily. Again she eyed Giyuu's nest, this time with interest. Awkwardly, he gestured for her to enter. How strange this was, sharing a nest with a demon. He never thought he'd see the day. She settled down beside him, shifting to get herself comfortable. She glanced at him, almost as if asking for permission to lay down. He nodded. "Get comfortable. I don't mind." As awkward as he felt, he didn't mind. He was just being shy, and for once was not uncomfortable. Nezuko settled back down, closing her eyes. He almost worried that she'd fall back asleep for another 2 years, until she rolled over and tucked herself against his side. He tensed. She tensed up too, opening one of her eyes to squint at him. She whined softly, a silent apology. She turned to roll over again, clearly disappointed. Giyuu grabbed her, pressing her back against his side before he could help it. His eyes were wide with shock as his body seemed to move on its own accord, stroking her hair and cuddling her. This was so weird, but he couldn't say he hated it. He curled around her, purring softly. It was a funny sound, out of tune and out of practice. Still, it seemed to soothe Nezuko once she stopped giggling. He was already half asleep by the time Orokodaki came back inside. "She woke up?" he asked, his voice quiet. Giyuu nodded tiredly, not bothering to open his eyes. He was glad Orokodaki didn't question the nest, or the ongoing purr, or anything about the situation he was in. Orokodaki carefully stepped around the nest, not wanting to enter without permission. "You can sit down," Giyuu said through a yawn, embarrassed with how childish he was acting. Orokodaki sat behind him, grabbing a hairbrush out of nowhere. He worked through his student's silky hair, working out the tangles and smoothing down the curls. Giyuu leaned back against his teacher, rumbling purrs increasing in volume. "You seem more peaceful, Giyuu," he pointed out. "I'm glad to see you taking care of yourself." Nezuko chirped in agreement, loosely holding the water Hashira's hand. "I hope you had a good rest, Nezuko." Orokodaki laughed softly, reaching over to pat her head. "You worried us." She chirped again, this one more sheepish and apologetic. Giyuu was on the brink of sleep when he felt the brush pull away, being placed a bit further away. Orokodaki hugged him from behind, scenting him like he used to, scenting him like a parent would do to their pups. Before he slipped completely into unconsciousness, he made a lazy attempt at scenting his master back, scenting Nezuko into the process as well. He wished things could stay like this forever, even if he realistically knew that wasn't possible. Throughout the next 3 days, Nezuko woke up every night, falling back asleep by sunrise. On the last day of final selection, they all waited restlessly, sipping at tea in silence. Orokodaki excused himself to chop more wood and go back to building whatever it was he was building. Nezuko stared at Giyuu expectantly. "He'll be here any minute," he promised, hoping it was true. He wasn't sure what he would do if Tanjirou died. He didn't want to think about it, or else he'd be sick. She leaned against his side, holding his hand. It was only a couple more hours later that she abruptly stood up, running outside. Panicked, Giyuu followed her. What was going on? Were they under attack? Where was she going? "Nezuko, you're awake!" Tanjirou's strained voice echoed through the mountain, followed by an exhausted sob. Giyuu tossed his sword to the side, running to see the siblings. "Tanjirou," Giyuu greeted breathlessly, almost managing a smile, but not quite. "I'm glad you're okay." He checked the kid over with his eyes, looking for injuries. He couldn't see much, as all his wounds were already bandaged up, but he assumed he was more or less all right if he was sent home right away. "Giyuu!" Tanjiro wiggled against Nezuko's tight hold, reaching for the water Hashira. "You're here." "Yeah, Giyuu held the boy's hand, letting himself be pulled into the tight hug. "I didn't leave." "Did something happen?" Tanjiro worried. "No, I just..." How was he supposed to explain that he couldn't fight because he was too shaky and anxious to properly hold a sword? "It's nothing, don't worry about it." Tanjiro nodded, seeming to acknowledge that it wasn't his business. Giyuu thoroughly scented the boy, not liking the way his marking had been washed off from the overwhelming week the boy had. Tanjiro laughed, hugging Giyuu even tighter. Orokodaki came up from behind them, pulling all 3 of them into his arms. His comforting pine and sandalwood scent washed over them, blanketing them all in a sense of safety. This was what home felt like, and for the first time in 7 years, Tomioka was almost regretful that he'd pushed his emotions aside for so long. Giyuu had to leave the next day, but the night before that he'd made another nest, a proper one this time, and slept the night with his master and his 2, friends. He wasn't sure what the Kamado siblings were to him. They were important to him. He knew that much. He wasn't sure if he would call them his children, that seemed a bit too much, and he wasn't sure if he deserved being called their older brother, either. But they were family, and he would lay down his life to protect them both. Before he left, he ruffled Tanjiro's hair. "Stay safe. Have fun. You'll do great." He wasn't good at encouragement. Yet, judging by the way Tanjiro's eyes lit up, he assumed he did a good enough job. He hugged Orokodaki before he left, promising to send letters and visit more often. Seriously, this time. Not as a comforting lie. And just like that, he was off again. And unfortunately, he wouldn't see the siblings in person for another 3 months. Chapter 4. Spider Family. 3 months is a short time for anyone else, but for Giyuu, 3 months is too long. Too long to go without seeing your wards. Even as his body ached with exhaustion, he made sure to send them an update after every mission. He responded to every single one of Tanjiro's letters. He was pleased to know that Tanjiro was growing stronger as the days passed. And Nezuko was doing well. Tanjiro even made a few friends. And despite how odd they sounded from the way he described them, Giyuu was pleased that he wouldn't be adventuring completely alone. He was in the middle of sending a letter to Tanjirou when Oyakata's crow perched on his windowsill. He looked up, waiting for what his next mission would be. As he walked the familiar path to the Hashira garden, he let himself bask in the sunlight for once. He hoped Tanjirou was resting well. An hour later, he was running through a cobweb-filled forest with Kocho Shinobu. They'd been sent together to hunt down one of the 12 Kizuki, apparently. To be honest, though, he was quite annoyed. Kocho kept poking at everything he did, teasing him. He knew she wanted a reaction, but he wouldn't give her one, making sure his face stayed stoic. He was used to her taunts by now. You see, Tomioka and Kocho weren't exactly friends. That's not to say they weren't enemies. It's just that the insect pillar tolerated him more than the other pillars did. Not to mention she was his doctor and knew every single thing about him. The main thing that she didn't agree with was his decision to drug his instincts away. While her older sister KNY had been a patient and caring Omega, Shinobu was the exact opposite, a snarky alpha hiding behind a plastic smile. "The moon is beautiful tonight, isn't it?" she chimed, waiting for an answer that they both knew she wouldn't get. She huffed a bitter laugh. "Same as always, Tomioka. I think it's about time we split up. See you soon." And just like that, she diverged from the path and headed one way. So, of course, Giyuu headed towards the opposite direction. He scanned the dead body hanging in the air, unease growing in his stomach. Whatever was going on here, it wasn't good. He was at least relieved at the thought that Tanjirou wasn't anywhere near here. With ease, he jumped and sliced off a massive spider demon's head. The demonslayer, who'd almost died, fell to the ground and stared at him. It was hard to see their expression behind that freakish boar mask, but the scent of confident, cocky juvenile alpha was obvious. The boar guy started ranting about how he wanted Giyuu to fight him. When he refused, he mentioned something about the spider being one of the 12 Kizuki. "Huh?" Giyuu blinked, unimpressed. "That was not one of the 12 Kizuki. That was just a regular demon. Couldn't you tell?"
"Of course I knew,"
the young alpha bit back defensively.
"I was just repeating what Manchiro said."
Manchiro? What an odd name. After safely tying up the boar before he could hurt himself, Giyuu dashed off again. There was no doubt about it. There was definitely one of the 12 here. Even if it hadn't been that massive one, something bad was happening. Demons don't gather in groups unless there's a proper reason to. As Giyuu ran through the forest, he found himself unconsciously scanning the faces of the corpses hanging in the trees. He comforted himself with the fact that none of them were Tanjirou or Nezuko, but it still sickened him at the fact that the majority of these slayers were so young. Not as young as Tanjirou, but still too young to be dying. Biting his lip, he wondered if Tanjirou's ribs had healed yet. He was glad Tanjirou wasn't here. It was too dangerous. It was... Nezuko! Was that... Fuck. Once again, he was glad he had taken those scent blockers, because if he hadn't, the scent of an extremely distressed Omega would have flooded the entire forest. And no doubt that would have attracted unwanted attention. Clutching the hilt of his sword, he rushed towards the sound, urging himself to go faster. Why was Tanjirou here? They should have been kept far away from this place. Stupid, stupid, stupid. Calm down, he urged himself. He couldn't use water breathing unless he controlled his breathing. He couldn't do anything until he calmed down. Tanjirou would be fine. Nezuko would be fine. They'd be fine because he was coming to rescue them. Anxiety curled tightly in his chest, choking him. Giyuu jumped into the air, letting himself fall into the numbness of the medication, swinging his blade down. He'd missed the demon's neck, but he'd cut through the threads that were about to slice open his wards.
"Where do you keep coming from?"
the demon snarled, claws flexing from agitation.
"You're messing up my plans."
Forcing himself to face ahead, forcing himself to block out Tanjirou's cries and Nezuko's weak moans, Giyuu raised his blade. As the spider demon unleashed their demon blood art again, Giyuu used Lol, the secret 11th form of water breathing. As he breathed, letting the strings bounce off of him, he distantly wondered if Tanjirou would be interested in learning Lol. It was a good move to know. It would keep him safe. He made a mental note to teach Tanjirou once they were out of this mess. The demon, clearly jostled by the fact that not a single one of its strands touched Giyuu, charged forward to attack. Giyuu took the time to slice its neck off, tripping it before he could even think about touching the siblings. As he calmed, he pulled out one of those blood extractors from his pocket, stabbing it into the demon's back before it disintegrated. Tanjirou sent him a few in one of his letters. With the demon gone, Giyuu's panic washed over him and drowned him like a tidal wave. Gasping for breath, he turned around, rushing towards the two pups. "Tanjirou, what are you doing here?" He fussed over them, checking for injuries. They weren't that bad, just exhausted, and Nezuko's beautiful kimono was drenched in blood. But he made a note to wash it and maybe buy her a spare one. "We were sent here." Tanjirou's eyes drooped with exhaustion. "What was that move just now?" he panted. "I thought water breathing only had 10 forms." "Oh, Suddenly sheepish from the admiration in the kid's eyes, he managed a small smile. "I made that move myself. Would you like me to teach it to you when you're healed?" Despite how exhausted he was, and despite how much pain he was in, Tanjiro grinned brighter than the sun. "I'd like that." Giyuu opened his mouth to answer, but... Clang. Giyuu parried Kocho's sword with his own, knocking her backwards. "Oh." The alpha blinked, caught off guard. "Tomioka, you know it's against core rules to stop me from killing a demon." When he didn't answer, she turned to Tanjiro. "Boy, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but that little girl you're protecting is actually a demon. Please step back and let me." "Please don't. She's my sister." Tanjiro reached for his sword, hands shaking. "Oh, my. I'm sorry to hear that. In that case, I'll use a painless poison. No need to worry. I promise she won't suffer. Please step back now and—" "Leave them alone, Kocho." Tomioka stood defensively over the two of them. "You're breaking core rules, Tomioka. I advise you to step back now." Shinobu answered easily. A mean glint sparkled in her eyes. "I can't do that. And I can't just leave this demon alone either. Please trust me on this." She didn't answer, only sharpening her glare. "She's different from the other demons. Shinobu didn't answer, injecting more poison into her blade. In turn, Tomioka raised his sword. "You're raising your sword against me. That's definitely breaking a law," she hummed as she raised her own sword. Before they could launch themselves at each other, a crow's ear-splitting shriek rang through the forest. "Master requests you bring Kamado Tanjiro, Kamado Nezuko, and Tomioka Giyuu to his mansion. A trial, I repeat." It flew off to spread the word. Kocho sheathed her sword. "Are those the Kamado siblings, then?" Giyuu nodded stiffly, feeling sick. He crouched down to place Nezuko back in her box. When he reached for Tanjiro, he was interrupted by a trio of Kakashi. Before he could protest, the siblings were carried away. He watched them go, swallowing back a cry. This was scary. "Now then, are restraints needed for you, Tomioka?" She crept up behind him, the twisted grin showing that she was enjoying this. He swallowed thickly around the lump in his throat. "No need. Let's go." Chapter 5. Hashira Meeting. "Nezuko is different from other demons," he repeated, anxiety rising like bile in his throat despite his neutral expression. "Can you at least listen instead of swinging your blade around?" He bit back a sigh. Kocho spun her blade around continuously, cutting down cobwebs and loose twigs. She didn't answer him. She'd been silent the entire time they walked. "She hasn't eaten anyone. It's been almost 3 years, and she's never hurt anyone." Giyuu was on the verge of pleading now. He needed at least Kocho to trust him. She was the closest to him. He needed at least one ally. Nezuko would die if he couldn't convince any of them. She would be murdered. His pup would be killed, and the other would most likely be punished in exile from the Corps. "Kocho, please just listen." "I advise you to save your sob story for when we face Oyakata," she replied coldly, her grin full of malice. "He will decide what to do." Feeling sick, Giyuu turned away and fell quiet, drowning within his own mind. They waited in the garden, waiting for the other pillars to arrive. They'd been the first to arrive, yet it didn't take long for the other 7 to swing by. Before they'd even approached, he could smell the bitterness of their rage. There would be no reasoning. Nezuko would die today, and Giyuu could do nothing about it, because, after all, he was useless. Even after everything, he was still the pathetic pup who'd done nothing as Sabito's head was crushed to bits. Another wave washed over him as he tried to uselessly swim to the surface. The others were talking amongst themselves, cursing their outrage. Shinobu joined in easily, spewing insults. Giyuu took a few steps back, wanting to be as far away from the others as possible.
Tomioka.
Where was Tanjirou?
Tomioka.
Where did they take him? Was he being treated, or was he just tied up somewhere?
Oi, Tomioka, listen to me when I'm fucking speaking to you.
An alpha's voice cut through the air, harsh and oh so overwhelming. Almost fearfully, he lifted his head, meeting Shinazagawa's gaze. Shinazagawa had used his alpha voice on him. No, that didn't. That's not allowed. That's against core rules. He looked around at the other Hashira, waiting for one of them to say something. He found no sympathy in the crowd, aside from a stunned Kanroji and an uncomfortable Renkoku and Himajima. Everyone else was uncaring. Giyuu opened his mouth to speak, yet only a weak choked sound came out, sounding way too similar to a pained whine. If anyone took notice, which they probably hadn't, they didn't comment or show any reaction. He focused back on Shinazagawa's scarred face. Shinazagawa was what you would call a stereotypical alpha, cocky, rude, dominating, and powerful. His scent was an overwhelming smoky firewood smell, pleasant to some people, yet uncomfortable for others. And that was the perfect way to describe Shinazagawa. Most adored him, others despised him. Giyuu honestly couldn't make any comments on the wind pillar. He hadn't had an opinion on him. He respected him, that's all. Yet, for some reason, the Wind Hashira despised him. Giyuu didn't know why, and nobody else was helpful in explaining it.
What the hell is this about? You were helping a demon? You raised your blade against Kocho to protect that thing. I don't know what's wrong with you, but you really piss me off. Why are you even here if you're going to pull shit like that?
Just as he was about to grasp land, an undertow pulled him back and shoved him back under. He blinked, unable to speak. But Sanemi ordered him to speak. He had to say something. He had to. Shinazagawa, Rengoku murmured. I think that's enough. Let's wait for Oyakata to arrive. Even though he barely spoke to the flame pillar, even if he overwhelmed Giyuu appreciated him, even if only for this one moment.
Oyakata will be arriving shortly,
one of those Kakushi announced. Immediately they all kneeled down respectfully, even if their leader hadn't even arrived yet. As soon as the Kakushi left, another Kakushi scrambled up into the garden, and Tanjirou, kind-hearted Tanjirou, who didn't have a mean bone in his body, was being tossed to the cement like trash. Still unconscious, his head sliced open and slowly bleeding. Clearly, by his appearance, he hadn't been treated or patched up at all. Oi, wake up. The Kakushi kicked him with his foot. Swiftly Tanjiro woke, scrambling to sit up. He looked around wildly, wincing in pain as everything spun around. Where? What? Tanjiro sputtered, wreaking his distress. Tomioka inconspicuously rubbed his hand against his own clothed knee, grabbing Tanjiro's attention. He blinked slowly, trying to signal for his pup to calm down. Tanjiro calmed a bit when he saw Giyuu. Yet, the fear came back tenfold when he couldn't see Nezuko or her box anywhere in sight. Nezuko. Nezuko! The other Hashiras blinked, judging him. Anxiously, Giyuu tried to catch his pup's attention again, but a sharp yet curious glance from Shinobu had him still. Giyuu lowered his head, focusing on calming his own breathing. He would be no use to Tanjiro unless they both calmed down. Ha! Shinazagawa's mocking laugh cut through the air as he stepped back into view, carrying a wooden box. Nezuko's box.
This your demon sister, brat?
Shinazagawa inspected the box with crazed eyes, his gaze filled with bloodthirst.
Stop. Please, leave her alone. She hasn't killed anyone. She'd never hurt anyone. Please don't. You expect us to believe that? Iguro commented bitterly, narrowing his eyes at the pup. Giyuu's claws dug into his palms. He ignored the sticky blood, trying to use the dull pain to ground himself. Shinazagawa raised his blade. It cut through the box, piercing the demon within. Giyuu drowned. Alphas were known for their protectiveness, their confidence, and their leadership. Betas were known for their flexibility. They could take on the role of a leader or a follower, depending on the group they were with. They were reliable, and could be just as fierce as an alpha, while also being as pissy as an omega. Omegas were well known for their patient, caring nature. They were sensitive souls, but that's not to say they were weak. No, omegas were terrifying, especially when their pups were in danger. Shinazagawa's blade dug through the box, stabbing into the demon, and the high-pitched wail that rang through the garden was unbearable. A pup was crying. 2 pups were crying, Tanjirou and whatever was in that box. When a pup cried like this, usually their parents came running, no matter how far away they were. It was a cry for help, only used when in severe distress or danger. And for a second, nothing happened. Then all hell broke loose. Shinazagawa was sent flying. Everyone else had fallen over in the process of whoever it was that rushed over. The box that contained the demon was placed down in front of that Kamado kid. The boy wrapped himself around it, protecting it with his own body as he sobbed. As their days cleared, they all realized that it had just been Tomioka to rush to the kid's aid. The water pillar reeked of distressed, enraged Omega. But that didn't make sense. Tomioka was a beta, right? Tomioka was a dull-scented, antisocial beta. However, his scent was so clear. A fresh sea salt breeze washing over them all. It quickly became overwhelming and stung to breathe, poisoned by fear, anger, despair, along with so many other feelings. To say they were confused was an understatement. Kocho was the first to speak. Well, she didn't really speak. She laughed. "Oh, of all things," she chuckled, not giving them any context. "Oi, Kocho, what the fuck is happening?" Shinazagawa demanded, face red with anger as he picked himself back up. "And what the hell is going on with you, Tomioka?" He intended to step forward, yet Giyuu's challenging snarl had him pause. A challenging growl of his own rumbled in the back of his throat. "Shinazagawa, knock it off!" Uzui snapped, raising his hands defensively when Giyuu's dilated eyes landed on him. Himejima murmured prayers quietly, wishing for everyone's safety to be secured by the end of this. Kanroji faltered. She knew her place in this pack. As an Omega, she should be intervening in fights like this. But it was different when it came to Shinazagawa and Tomioka. With a strangled whimper, she covered her face fearfully. Iguro came to her side, checking her over. Other than that, he did nothing to help the situation. Kocho's laughter had quieted, and now she watched the situation unfold with amusement. Tokita blinked, still appearing to be in a daze. He yawned, uninterested. He directed his gaze upward to the clouds, watching and waiting. Renkoku had stood up slowly, not wishing to alarm the borderline feral Omega. He cursed venomously under his breath. Damn Shinazagawa and his inability to read the room. And damn the rest of them for being so stupid. He tried to move forward, wanting to be helpful unlike the rest, but he was stuck when Giyuu's second growl directed at him. "Rengoku, don't get any closer." Kocho finally spoke. "Shinazagawa, stay where you are and put your blades away, slowly." She turned her gaze to Giyuu, then, "Calm yourself down, Tomioka. Deep breaths. We won't move until Oyakata comes, okay?" Tomioka nodded stiffly, still not taking his eyes off the pillars. He crouched next to Tanjirou, fussing over him. The Kamado kid sobbed openly, mumbling the word, "Nezuko," over and over again. "She's hurt! She's hurt! Giyuu!" He whimpered high-pitched. Giyuu? They were on a first-name basis. Just how close were these two, anyway? How'd they even know each other? This seemed to surprise even Kocho. Her eyes widened, but quickly narrowed again. They kneeled and waited.
much to Shinozagawa's and Iguro's unhappiness. So many questions were left unanswered, but if they asked, there was no doubt they'd be attacked. Rengoku lowered himself back to the ground, sighing defeatedly. Once Tomioka had Kamado properly calmed down, he turned his piercing gaze towards his fellow pillars. "If you move so much as a muscle," he growled warningly, directing his words specifically to Shinozagawa, "I'll tear your arm off and shove it down your slitted throats." Kanroji trembled, curling into herself. Noticing this, Iguro curled his lip, but otherwise didn't act out. All they could do now was wait for the master to arrive. Hopefully he'd be able to calm them all down. As Ubuyashiki Kagaya entered the garden, he could already smell the thick uneasiness in the air. Slowly, he blinked, taking in the scents one by one. Shinozagawa and Iguro reeked of rage. Kanroji smelled fearful. Uzui and Himejima smelled uneasy. They weren't scared, but they weren't quite calm either. Tokido's scent was unfeeling as ever, though tinted with a bit of curiosity. Rengoku smelled a bit sad, a bit nervous. Kocho, for one, smelled delighted. Meanwhile, poor Tomioka reeked of horror, frustration, and grief. His Omegan scent was open for everyone to see. Something bad must have happened, he knew, and when he picked up what he assumed to be Kamado's mournful scent mixed with 2 different smells of blood, he could guess what went wrong. "What is going on, my dear children?" Kagaya asked calmly. "May one of you explain?" He chose Kocho to speak, trusting her to state it plainly. After the insect pillar spoke matter-of-factly, Ubuyashiki had his daughters lead him towards Tomioka. He felt Tomioka tense, the new scent of fear mingling with the other scents. In return, he let his pheromones release, hoping to calm them all down. He kept his neck in plain sight and moved slowly. "Tomioka, hello, and this must be the Kamado siblings." He blinked warmly. "I've heard so much about you from Orokodaki." "Isn't that the former water hashira?" he heard Kanroji mumble to someone, getting a grunt of affirmation in response. "You have my apologies, Tomioka," Kagaya continued, smiling comfortingly. "I did not mean for your pups to be harmed." "Pups?" Kanroji whispered. "But there's only one."
"Does he mean the demon?"
Uzui choked on his own words, mortified at the mere thought. Ignoring his other kids, he continued. "I promise they will be safe from here onwards. Girls, may you go collect some nesting materials." His daughters left to fulfill his wishes dutifully. Content, he offered his wrist's scent gland to Tomioka. Tomioka rubbed against him respectfully, sighing as the fear ebbed away. "Sorry," he whispered sheepishly. "No need. We are the ones who made the error," he soothed, standing back up. He had Tokito to guide him back to his chair. Sitting, beckoned for Giyuu to come sit under the shade. Picked up the box delicately, held Tanjirou's hand, leading them over into a dark corner. The girls returned, handing Giyuu the blankets. Over the few months Giyuu had spent at Orokodaki's with the siblings, his nesting skills had greatly improved. They weren't perfect, especially since he was under stress right now, but it was a bit more than acceptable. He climbed inside, dragging Tanjiro in with him. Placing the box inside the nest, he knocked against the wood door 5 times. The door creaked open. They all tensed, wondering what sort of monster would appear before them. A small hand matted in the blanket's material, almost kneading it like a cat. A second hand appeared. It poked its head out, turning towards them. "Fuck," Rengoku repeated softly, eyes wide with a mixture of horror and awe. Kanroji laughed nervously, sounding as if she were on the verge of tears. It was a toddler, a tiny fragile thing. It yawned around the bamboo muzzle. Disinterested in the crowd, it crawled over towards and laid down on top of Tanjiro. Giyuu checked her over. Her clothes were drenched in blood, but the stab wound that Shinozagawa had caused was closed. Only a scar remained. As satisfied as he could be in this situation, Giyuu hugged them both close, glaring fiercely at the rest of them. Ubuyashiki continued the meeting as if nothing happened, explaining the situation. They were all reluctant to accept this, but it's not like they had much of a choice. At the end, Giyuu delicately placed a sleepy Nezuko back into her box. "Are you able to carry her?" he whispered to Tanjirou. When the younger Omega nodded, he gave the box to him, and together, with Kocho beside them, they left for the butterfly mansion to be checked over. As everyone dispersed, gossiping, Rengoku and Shinazagawa lingered. Shinazagawa was shaking, glaring down at the ground as if it personally offended him. He knew he messed up. He just couldn't understand any of this. Tomioka was an Omega, and he'd adopted a demon? Meanwhile, Rengoku stared up at the sun, smiling softly. He stared down at his own hands, clasping them together. A light blush dusted the flame pillar's cheeks as he ran to catch up with the insect and water pillars. Shinazagawa hugged himself pathetically, making his way back to his own estate. This was something he really needed to think over. Technically, this is the end of the fanfic of When Floodgates Burst, but this is part of a series called Thicker Than Blood. It has a sequel called Moment of Peace, but it's been on hiatus since 2022, and they count as orphaned both of them, so I'm just gonna go ahead and read it. It only has one chapter, but it kind of sounds more like an ending to me. I'm imagining it more as like an epilogue. Moment of Peace. Shinobu led them towards her mansion. Holding Tanjirou's hand, he kept his head low, biting back the embarrassment of what just happened. Giyuu's secret was out. Everyone knew he was an Omega. They were judging him. Wait. That didn't matter anymore. Clenching his teeth, Giyuu slowly raised his head to a decent level. He'd done nothing wrong. He'd protected his family, and that's something he'd never be embarrassed about. Tanjirou was dragging his feet, limping. Giyuu would have carried him if they had been alone, but he knew he would have only embarrassed Tanjirou in front of Kocho if he tried. "Tomioka, Kocho, Kamado." A loud voice sounded from behind them. Biting his lip almost till it bled, Giyuu turned around. Rengoku beamed at him, cheerful as always. "Tomioka, Kamado, I sincerely apologize for what just happened. Please know I stand with you, and Tomioka, Omega or not, you're amazing as always." Tanjiro squinted at the flame Hashira doubtfully. Giyuu squeezed his hand a bit tighter. Rengoku had always been friendly with him. Even back there, he'd been sympathetic, despite his neutrality. So, slowly, Giyuu nodded. "It's okay."
"Rengoku, I apologize for interrupting, but I really must get Kamado treated, and give Tomioka space to properly calm down."
Kocho spoke up.
"So, if you'll excuse us."
"Of course." Rengoku nodded vigorously. "I'll stop by soon. Rest well, both of you." He watched them leave, a dopey smile on his face. As weird as that was, Giyuu didn't see him as a threat. Kocho led them inside.
"Kamado,"
she asked.
"your friends are in a room together. Would you like to join them, or stay with Tomioka?"
Tanjiro looked up at his caretaker, a question in his eyes. Giyuu shuffled on his feet, contemplating what Tanjiro was silently asking of him. He didn't know Tanjiro's friends, but, well, who was he to deny him? "I'll join them too."
"Are you sure?"
Shinobu asked, clearly surprised.
"They're both quite rambunctious."
He nodded again, biting back a sigh. This was going to be a pain. He didn't like socializing. He didn't like sharing rooms with people. But if Tanjiro liked them, maybe they weren't all that bad. No, they were definitely that bad. The yellow one, in Omega, was screaming his head off, putting up a fuss over some medicine. The boar guy, in Alpha, was sulking on his bed, unmoving and barely responsive. Very different from the boar he'd met in the spider forest. The blonde one screaming was seriously giving Giyuu a headache. Holding back another sigh, he buried his face in his pillow. He was starting to wish he'd gone with Shinobu to set up a room for Nezuko. Tanjiro was trying to soothe the yellow one. Zenitsu? Was that his name? And was failing more or less. Tanjiro eventually gave up, letting Zenitsu be dealt with by the butterfly girls. He climbed into the bed next to Giyuu, giving his caretaker a tired smile. He flopped back against the pillows, falling asleep almost instantly. Giyuu watched his pup fondly, heart warm. It was then he realized that the yellow guy had stopped screaming, and now both him and the boar were staring at him intensely. "Hey." Zenitsu spoke first, voice rough from the previous yelling. You're on Tanjirou's side, right? Tanjirou's our friend, so are you on our side? Even if it was phrased as a question, the plain threat beneath the words was clear as day. Sitting up, Giyuu rubbed at his eyes. If I was against him, I would have killed both him and his sister the day I found them. Inosuke and Zenitsu both bristled at that. Maybe it was the wrong thing to say. Wilting a bit, Giyuu explained properly. I was the one who found Tanjirou and Nezuko after their family had been murdered, and after Nezuko was turned. I sent them to Orokodaki. I helped them become demon slayers. I've been helping them whenever and however I can. They're my pups, they're my family. So, to answer your question, no, I'm not against you. He clarified, surprisingly letting himself be vulnerable towards these other two pups. I see. Zenitsu relaxed, eyes softening. He was a complete different person than the quivering crybaby Giyuu only saw moments ago. I'm glad they have a Hashira on their side, then. It'll help. Had these two not heard the news yet, there was no need to be worried. They've already been clearanced to stay with the demon slayers, even Nezuko. I know, but that doesn't mean people will treat them kindly, Zenitsu murmured. Inosuke grunted. Don't worry, Manitsu. My name is Zenitsu. We'll just beat up whoever touches my other minions. The alpha growled, though it was a bit dulled down by his exhaustion. Giyuu tilted his head, squinting at the boar. He couldn't really see where the guy was looking, thanks to his mask, but he kept moving his head in the direction of Tanjirou's sleeping form. He was an alpha. Tanjirou was an omega. Wait, were they? No. Tanjirou would have definitely let him know if he was being courted by anyone. Or at least Giyuu hoped he was trusted enough to know. Besides, maybe they were just friends? Just because they were an alpha and an omega traveling together. Giyuu laid back down against the pillows. Hey, don't fall asleep yet, Inosuke grumbled. Sighing, he sat back up. What is it? How come you're sharing a room with us, since you're so great and all? Inosuke growled, almost challengingly. Shouldn't a high-ranked demon slayer like you get your own room? Tanjirou wanted to be in the same room as you guys. He stated simply. And he wanted to be with me. I didn't want to let him out of my sight just yet either. Inosuke relaxed at that. Ha! No wonder he wanted to be in the same room as me. And Hinatsu, too, I guess. He grunted towards the end. Zenitsu, my name is Zenitsu. You know this, we've been traveling together for weeks. The blonde omega wailed, but his scent showed he wasn't actually upset. Giyuu laid back down against the pillows. This time, he wasn't disturbed. He chose not to fall asleep yet. He needed to talk to Kocho. Still, he didn't feel like talking, so he merely pretended to be asleep. If the other two pups noticed his faking, they didn't notice or didn't comment, instead choosing to bicker with each other. What an odd group these 4 pups were, Giyuu thought. Even if they were strange, he would approve of them since they clearly cared about the Kamado siblings. Satisfied, he blocked out their noise, losing himself in his thoughts. The next morning, when he heard Kocho step inside, he sat up quickly. I have to talk to you, he told her. I know, come. She beckoned for him to follow. The other 3 were sent to rehabilitation training after taking their morning medications. Giyuu got up and moved after her. They didn't speak until they were both within her soundproof office. Tomioka, as skeptical as I am about this situation, I apologize. Is what she started with. I apologize for being tactless, and I genuinely apologize for distressing you to such a state where even the scent blockers were useless. She sat down, eyes surprisingly soft. I know you wanted to keep your second gender a secret. Even if I didn't agree with your medication intake, you shouldn't have been forced to tell everyone like that. I don't care. He shrugged truthfully. They would have found out sooner or later. And as for the tactlessness, you never had any to begin with. He teased, surprising a laugh out of her. Barely hiding a smile of his own, he relaxed properly. How long are you going to keep me here? I should head out soon. He decided not to beat around the bush. Oyakata asked me to put you on break for a few weeks, Shinobu explained, sipping her tea quietly. He says you should rest before your next mission. Take your time and stay with Tanjirou while he heals. He bit back a sigh. He would love nothing more than to spend a week or two with his new family, but the world didn't work that way. People out there needed saving. He couldn't just sit around and do nothing. He opened his mouth to say as such, but Kocho cut him off again. You're not the only demon slayer out there, you know. You can trust other people, she says as if reading his mind. She stands abruptly, walking towards the window. In a month you'll be leaving with Rengoku to scout out the Infinity Train. Take this time to rest and prepare. I can tell you it'll be a tough mission. She hummed, exiting the room without another word. Giyuu blinked, stunned. A mission with Rengoku. That was a first. He couldn't ever recall being sent on a mission with anyone except Kocho. He retreated back to the sleeping ward, waiting for the others to return. It wasn't long before Tanjirou and his bizarre friends came back from their training. Instead of going to his own bed, Tanjirou hopped on top of Giyuu's, slumping defeatedly against his caretaker's chest. Wrapping his arms around his pup, Giyuu scented him. They'd go see Nezuko soon, but for now, all Tanjirou wanted was to be hugged, and who was Giyuu to deny him? Holding Tanjirou close, Giyuu closed his eyes. Inosuke and Zenitsu were bickering like they usually did, but fell silent when another presence entered the ward. It's you, from Final Selection! Zenitsu shrieked. Curious, Giyuu opened his eyes, staring at the new person. An alpha, big and strong, yet he still had that youthful scent about him. He couldn't be any older than the rest of the pups around him. He smelled a bit nervous, but hid it behind a scowl. He had been dragged into the room by Shinobu's apprentice. What was her name again? Kanao? She was another Omega, and had been helping rehabilitate Tanjirou and the others. Genya Shinazugawa will be staying with you for the time being, she explained, expression blank. Goodbye now. She turned and left silently. Her and Shinobu were similar in that way, then. Still, more importantly, this pup had the same last name as Sanemi. Were they related? But his colleague never mentioned having a brother. Maybe they had a bad relationship. Who knew? Whatever the reason, Giyuu kept his guard up, unsure if this Genya person would act similar to his brother. Genya's eyes examined the room, cautiously. Scowl deepening, he chose the bed farthest from them, turning away from them. Shinazugawa? Tanjirou stirred from his half-asleep state. He pulled back from Giyuu's arms, blinking at the newcomer. You have the same name as the Wind Hashira. He pointed out the obvious. Is he your big brother? None of your business, Genya snapped. Giyuu tried to pull Tanjirou back to his chest, wanting to shield him from the bitterness of this new pup. Tanjirou wriggles out of his arms again, standing up. I don't care if you are. It's good to see you again, though. How have you been? He asked, kind as ever. Giyuu looked over his shoulder, watching Tanjirou blankly. Stop trying to be friendly after you broke my fucking arm, he grunted, unamused. That was ages ago. I would apologize, but you deserved it for what you did to those girls. Tanjirou kept smiling, unfazed. Whatever, Genya grunted, turning away again. Shinazugawa was the one who stabbed Nezuko, right? Tanjirou asked the water pillar. Is he always that short-tempered? Shinazugawa always had a dislike for me. I don't know the reason, Giyuu explained. But you're both Hashiras, Zenitsu added on. Shouldn't all of you be getting along? None of them like me very much. Giyuu shrugged. Genya slowly sat up, facing towards the group again. You're a Hashira? He asked Giyuu almost hesitantly. Giyuu nodded. You work with my brother? He nodded again. Then at some point, can you help me pass a message on to him? Giyuu blinked, thinking it over. I can try, but like I said, he doesn't like me. I don't think he'll listen to me, especially not after what happened last night. He sniffed. And to be honest, I have quite a disliking for him too right now. Tanjirou nodded along. He stabbed Nezuko. Ah? Zenitsu shrieked, thunder crackling around the room. He stabbed Nezuko? Both Giyuu and Tanjirou nodded in sync. That bastard! Zenitsu shrieked, jumping to his feet. I'm going to kill him! He stormed out of the room. Zenitsu, stop it! Tanjiro raced after his friend. That left Giyuu, along with Genya and Inosuke. Great. He's weird. Genya spoke first, watching the door. Who? Giyuu questioned. That Kamado guy. He's strange. What do you mean by that? Giyu's eyes narrowed. I mean he's different from other Omegas I've met. Genya's face flushed as he realized what he'd just said. He buried his face in his pillow, ignoring the existence of Inosuke and Giyuu. Inosuke burst out laughing. I know, right? He's so fierce, he's amazing. He's like the perfect rival, the perfect minion. Giyuu blinked. Did they both like Tanjiro? Would they both try to court Tanjiro? He wasn't really sure how he felt about that. From what he'd seen, these two were brutes, and Tanjiro was, well, to be blunt, Tanjiro was a godsend. If he had to choose, though, Giyuu guessed he'd approve of Inosuke, if only because Inosuke wasn't related to the Wind Hashira. Maybe that was biased. Still, he couldn't help but be a bit overprotective of his pup. Sighing, he leaned back against the pillows. A month. He'd have to spend an entire month here, stuck with these two rowdy pups who never knew how to shut up and stay still for even a minute. Rubbing his eyes, Giyuu left the room. He moved towards Nezuko's secluded room, entering after knocking twice. As it was nightfall, Nezuko was already out of her box. She was laying on the bed, probably having just woken up. She sat up, yawning around her muzzle. She blinked sleepily at Giyuu, making grabby hands in his direction. Smiling softly, he climbed into the bed, holding her as she wanted. He found himself humming a gentle lullaby, something his sister used to sing to him. Nezuko chirped, nuzzling into his neck, falling back asleep. Her stab wound had healed, her kimono had been washed. Even still, the pain of helplessness as she'd been attacked was still there, and it still stung like hell. I'll do better, he promised, kissing her forehead. I won't let anyone ever hurt you again, not ever. You or your brother, I'll protect you both. He swore on his own life. It wasn't long until he fell asleep, holding Nezuko tightly. Somewhere amidst the middle of the night, Tanjiro entered, squishing himself into the cuddle pile. Tanjiro purred himself to sleep. It was small, tender moments like this that Giyuu loved the most. If he had it his way, the world would always be like this. What a shame the world didn't work that way.